with the title A Strategic Agenda for the European Union. Where do we want to stand in 2029? We've had quite the year. The European Parliament elections were in June, and in 2 days, finally, the new European Commission will take office in what are quite turbulent times. Challenges like war, climate, and competitiveness are more urgent than ever, while the far-right forces gain traction on the continent. And of course, Trump was elected in the US on the same day on which the German government, as the biggest EU member state, collapsed. During the last 2 days, we gathered high-level speakers and key actors from France, Germany, and Europe here in Berlin on the Pariser Platz to discuss the main challenges for the EU in the next 5 years. And now, as the final event of these 2 days, we would like to tackle with you the very overarching question of where do we want to be in 2029? So after this mandate finishes, where should we be in 2029? And where can we be in 2029? So what is actually achievable in this next term that we have? And I'm very happy to be here with a very great panel to discuss this quite big question. We have Thiago Antunes here, Senior Fellow of the Florence School of Transnational Governance of the EUY and former Secretary for State for European Affairs of Portugal. Nadja Pandl, Foreign Affairs Correspondent at the Spiegel, a German magazine who covers EU politics, and before she was the French correspondent for the Süddeutsche Zeitung. Joseph de Weck, who's a Senior Fellow at Institut Montaigne, and last but not least, Lukas Guttenberg, who is a Senior Advisor at the Bertelsmann Stiftung, and previously an advisor to the Economics Minister, and of course, before that, the Deputy Director of the Jacques Delors Center. I am Tu Nguyen. I am now the Deputy Director of the Jacques Delors Center, and I will moderate this session. Lukas, maybe let's start with the question, what are the main challenges that the EU now faces? So really at the start of a new mandate, right at the beginning of a legislative period, what will be the projects that the EU needs to tackle by 2029?
So, I mean, there are many, but I would say there are 3.5 central areas. Three areas of like policy content, and then one which is more on the structure. So I think the first and the most obvious one is that we, by 2029, hopefully have a new security order in Europe, with Ukraine still territorially intact and a security structure on the European side that means that we cannot be attacked by Russia or by whoever, and ideally independent, or at least not as dependent as today, on US support. That is a very bold goal, and I think we can discuss like how far that is achievable, or if not, what are the substitutes to that. But I think security is the overarching question for the next 5 years. I think the second area is the economy. I think by 2029 we should have reversed the current trend, which means that Europe at the moment is falling behind the US and China. And I think in the Draghi report, most of the elements that we need to do, or that we at least should look at to reach that goal, are already on the table. I think it's now a question of political will and a bit of governance and financing. And I think we can discuss that as well, that need to be addressed. But I think at least the analysis is on the table, and the gaps are well identified. And the third part, and I think we tend to forget that these days, is still climate. By the end of this decade, we should have identified both the goal for 2040 and the whole architecture of how we want to reach close to neutrality by 2040. I think the decade that follows this one, 2030 to 2040, will be really the key one, where we have to do the hard part of the way. And that means to take a lot of important decisions in the next 5 years of how we want to tackle that hard part of the way to get to neutrality then in 2050. And the 3.5 part would be the whole question of putting the money on the table to actually be able to do that. In 2027, we have to agree to the new long-term EU budget, which will start then in 2028, and which should enable the EU to really pursue the policy priorities that we have identified in common, because if we don't put the money where our mouth is, then we will not achieve these like pretty ambitious objectives that I've just outlined.
Thank you. Tiago, you were the Secretary for State for European Affairs in Portugal. So you were in Brussels at the table. Do you think we are institutionally, politically, and in the member states set up to tackle the challenges that Lucas just mentioned? Can we achieve them?
Well, thank you for having me. Well, if you ask me if we're well equipped or sufficiently equipped to deal with all of these challenges, my very blunt and honest answer would have to be no. We still have a lot to do on most or all of these fronts. I mean, take defense, for instance. There's still a long way to go to have, a defense union, to be able to procure better, to buy European, to ensure interoperability. And even beyond the strictly military point of view, in the current situation we are in, we're not at war, but we should be prepared for a war-like economy at least. And so we need procedures and powers to face extraordinary circumstances that are not there yet. We need more speed and more preparedness or readiness to react to unforeseen circumstances. On competitiveness, there's still a huge gap vis-a-vis the United States or even China. On R&D, we are lagging behind and we need to make up for that. On the digital and clean transitions, we need a lot of investment, as the Draghi report has told us. And so we need both public investment, that means more money, more European expenditure, and we need to be able to recycle European savings back into the economy. And still, we don't have a capital markets that is working properly to ensure that. On enlargement, which is another major challenge for the coming years, there's a lot of reforms, internal reforms, that we are still lacking and that we will need in order to be able to take on board new member states. If we mention also the rule of law, there's big challenges there because there are threats from outside, but there's this big threat from within of rule of law backsliding, and our instruments to deal with that are also not far from perfect. So perhaps on trade, I would say that's where we are better equipped to deal with a possible trade war that I hope does not materialize, but there we have more instruments. But even there, I mean, there's lots that still needs to be done in terms of economic security, of screening of investments, and ensuring that we are able to trade with other areas of the world. So on all of these fronts, we have a lot of homework and lots to do. So in order to be better equipped. And these are the things that we can foresee. Then on top of these are the unforeseen challenges, because you know that the unforeseen or unpredictable challenges were the game changer in the last mandate. So we still lack some institutions, some responses, some instruments. Of course, that is not to say that we haven't done a lot. We have done a lot over these past 5 years, but still a lot needs to be done. Now, the good news is that we know what needs to be done. We have now lots of reports. We have the Draghi report, we have the Letta report, the Ninisto report. We have even the political guidelines of the Commission, and we have this strategic agenda that was adopted by leaders before the summer, which is showing us the way that we need to go. So we have a roadmap. This is a good news. So we know what needs to be done to improve in all of these 3 years. And the other good news, I would say, and I'll be very, I'll challenge conventional wisdom here, and I will be very counterintuitive. I would say that a Trump administration will bring many problems, but to a certain extent, it is a good news in the sense that it will force us to take some action that would be much more difficult to take at European level otherwise. So there's an incentive to act and to agree on bold measures that we need to agree on. And usually only when there's a crisis in Europe do we manage to get the consensus around some key reforms. So we know what needs to be done. So the only question remaining is whether there will be the political will to do it. Will our leaders live up to the challenge? And if we listen to what they're saying, they're telling us that they will. There's this very bold, very strong statements. I will just quote from the strategic agenda. The leaders said this, and I think it's a very strong statement. We will live up to the call of the union's founders and ensure that the creativity of our responses matches the size of the challenges ahead of us. So they are telling us that they are ready, but let's see. We need to more than talk the talk, walk the walk. And so we can discuss a lot of this, not all, but a lot of this boils down to the next multi-annual budget of the European Union, whether the resources will be there. And so let's see if we manage, but at least we know, we know the way to go. The direction is set. So now we just need to take action.
Thank you. I will come back to this question of whether the election of Trump will force the EU member states into more common action or not. But before we do that, Joseph, both Lucas and Thiago said there is actually a roadmap. There's a plan for action, what we need to do. There is maybe a lack of funding, a lack of political will. And when it comes to this political will or leadership, a lot of times the Franco-German engine is mentioned, right? There's a theory that the Franco-German couple is not a sufficient one, but a necessary condition for the EU to take action. But we also know right now it is not working as well as we maybe would like it to work. And that is also due to the very difficult political circumstances in both countries. So can we expect any role of the Franco-German engine in the next legislative term, or do we have to actually say goodbye to the notion that France and Germany will lead the EU?
So it's true, we kind of know what needs to be done. And there's another period that was the late 1990s when Europe was in a similar sort of economic malaise. And Juncker famously said, we all know what needs to be done, but we don't know how to get reelected afterwards. That's what he said. I think this time, in a sense, we know what needs to be done. We also have a sort of political paralysis currently in Paris and Berlin that prevents the Franco-German engine to really work. But there is a perspective that this can be deblocked. Germany's political paralysis, I think, is more temporary in a sense. Yes, there is a fragmentation of the party landscape in Germany that makes politics and coalition building in Germany more complicated over the medium term. But by March, by April, there will be a German government, perhaps even a two-party coalition that is going to be more stable, more forceful, and most likely there is going to be a chancellor called Friedrich Merz, who has wanted to be chancellor for a long time and who by age 69 finally gets there. And Friedrich Merz, we've all known him. He's been around for a long time. And if there's one positive quality that we all know about him is that Europe for him is more than a Lippenbekenntnis. It's more than just a phrase. He started his career as a MEP in the European Parliament. He was an important voice at the time in the implementation of the Single European Act. That was the sort of agenda to liberalize the EU single market, especially in services as well. He was pushing that. He believes in the importance of this. If we see the statements that he does on sort of defense policy, on foreign policy, we see that he clearly thinks Europe has a bigger role to play. He pushes a lot of attention on the Franco-German couple. He has seen Macron in Paris in last December. So perhaps with Friedrich Merz, who thinks of himself to some extent as being in this lineage of Konrad Adenauer, Helmut Kohl, these sort of conservative chancellors of Germany, who often have been the ones on European integration, who have done the biggest sort of steps forward, there is perhaps a possibility, or we should hope for that there is a possibility of Berlin being able to reclaim leadership especially on the questions of defense and Ukraine, and perhaps the combination of the two. Merz, interestingly enough, was also the disciple of Wolfgang Schäuble, who was always a big champion of especially European defense integration. So maybe there's an opportunity there. For France, the question is more complicated. I think the political instability will continue for a while. The government might hold, but parliament will stay fragmented, even if there are snap elections in next summer. But there is still someone like President Emmanuel Macron, who's been around for a while, who has learned how to make deals in Europe. So Macron, Merz, this could be a sort of combination that could work again. There are good chances that it works better than between Macron and Scholz. Perhaps it's also a rather low bar. And then the other thing that is hopeful in a sense, if you listen to Merz and his statements on European and defense policy, he puts a lot of emphasis on the Weimar Triangle, and not only since yesterday, but for a long time. And clearly the Franco-German couple has for a long time not been sufficient to create any progress forward. But I think with German leadership reclaiming, there's a way to go there.
Perfect. That is a very optimistic, actually.
Yeah.
Many times I like that. Nadia, Joseph said that, yes, we know what to do, but politicians ask a question, if we do it, will we get re-elected? Is this the path to re-election? Is Europe the path to re-election? We know that Macron in 2017, of course, ran this pro-European platform very much. You, as a reporter, are on the ground quite a bit. You report from the ground in Europe a lot. So maybe you can tell us a bit, what do citizens expect of the EU? So what do they want for the next 5 years? Are there any expectations with regard to Europe? And if so, what kind of expectations?
That's a big question. So maybe to quickly name what I can actually talk about without feeling like a fraud. So I did work on the ground lately in Poland before the parliamentary election in Poland. Last year, in France, in every election since 2017, and in the Netherlands around the election where Geert Wilders' party came out the strongest. And I think, so right now my feeling is, after coming out of these discussions over 2 days where we talked about where do we stand at as European countries, there was a lot of talk about fake news and how do we influence the voters? How do we get truth across to the voters? And at some point, it seemed to boil down to the fact that we have all these great solutions that just don't come across because everything is sort of blurred by TikTok. And I don't think this is what happens. When you talk to people on the ground, obviously that's not representative, and I'm not a demoscope, like I don't, right? So I can talk from a gut feeling, but there are many people out there who are ordinary voters who are very well informed and who see the issues in their daily lives. And we talked about that before. And it's, for example, the housing market. It's the fact of having a job, maybe even having 2 jobs, but not being able to afford an okay house for you and your family, right? It's seeing that nobody really takes care of your parents in a retirement home because the system is collapsing. And these are very concrete things people see. And you don't need TikTok to blur a vision. Sort of that's a real problem. And then the question is, what offers do these people see? And when we look at the example of the Netherlands, there's a huge housing crisis. And what was the offer? From the political middle to the far right, there was a consensus. Yes, there's a problem and there's a solution, and that's zero immigration. Right? And if this is the only solution you give to people, and if you focus the whole debate on this, then you actually do not give people a real choice. So when we ask ourselves, where are we at in 2029, it's also what political offers do we give to people? And this question is very much a question that the political conservative center will have to ask themselves. Do we want to be a conservative force of reason, or do we want to try and sort of take the populist field and offer easy answers that basically boil down to zero migration? Whatever the question is, that is our answer, right? And I think this is very frustrating for voters. And when we look at on the ground in France, for example, I felt that considering how chaotic the situation was, right? Macron called snap elections and people are like, whoa, what? And it's in 2 weeks, okay. And I traveled all around France and I felt like people were actually confused, shocked, and well informed. And they were watching all these TV debates. And when I talked to people on the market, I felt like they were much less agitated than people in the TV studios, right? And it was just a very bad political offer. So we can't pretend like there's a great political offer and people just don't understand it. This is not what's happening. And when we look at Poland and we have a campaign run by Tusk that is a campaign for the protection of the rule of law, but it also comes with 100 very concrete steps saying this is what needs to be done in order for citizens to have a better quality of life in their everyday lives. And I'm not saying everything Tusk does is great or that everything that he promises is actually happening, because it's not. But people voted for this despite the fact that TVP, the national Polish media, had been turned into a propaganda media of the ruling party. And it is a very strong signal by voters that they are able to seek information and to make choices that are in their own interest if there is a substantial political offer.
Can I just react to it? Because I think there's a suggestion in the room that we know what to do. I think we know what the problem is. That's not the same as we know what to do. And I think there's, in the main fields that we just discussed, actually, they're competing visions. And I don't think we have an agreement at the European level at all what we want to do. If you look at this Budapest Declaration, which came out a few days after Trump was elected, I think it was testament to that. Like it said, literally, this is not the time for business as usual, which is when you have to put it there instead of showing that you're not doing business as usual. You like write it in the text, and that gives you all the information you need. That we are in a way politically not helpless. It's the wrong word, but we don't have a clear direction, and we don't have a roadmap. Like we have bits and pieces of the analysis, and I think that is why the Draghi report, for example, was so strong, because I think put a coherent analysis on the table. But look at, for example, at defense. If we tomorrow had 100 billion in additional European defense spending, I have no idea who would decide on how to spend it, what to spend it on. I think we would get massive fights between all the member states on how to use it. Half of them would say, yeah, we need to spend it on European defense goods. The other half would say, let's buy arms quickly because that's the most important thing. And I think you can have that in many policy areas that are actually key to the challenges we just identified. And there's no political consensus. And so I think it's not only a problem of that citizens don't understand that we have the great solutions. We actually don't really have the great solutions yet.
How do we find the great solutions then? Will the Trump election channel the necessary urgencies for the member states to find a compromise, do you think?
That's the other thing I don't agree with. I think we might get a bit more pressure in terms of finding solutions, but we also get a lot more problems that we have to solve. If we had another democratic administration, we would have, for example, the assurance that we don't have to worry that our whole security guarantee are maybe at risk or maybe not, we just don't know. We would not have the uncertainty about the support for Ukraine by the US, which are by far the biggest supporter. We wouldn't have the problem that we don't know whether we are in a trade war in half a year. So it multiplies the problem, first of all, and then maybe it also puts a bit more pressure on us to find solutions. But honestly, I think we are in a more politicized world where we just have competing competing sets of solutions to the same problem. Like on climate, for example, we have a clear directional choice. There are some parts of the political spectrum who want to roll back the Green Deal, who want to put into question all the goals we have agreed in the last 5 years, who probably at some point will say we will not reach climate neutrality by 2050 because it's too costly and because it puts too much burden on our citizens, especially in a situation where the US will now renege on their commitments. And we have a part of the spectrum which says we should stick to the objectives, and then there are ways to reach that. So I think, and this kind of directional choice, I think we have in a lot of policy areas.
Thiago, do you think we will be able to make a directional choice in Europe, or is Europe, as it is now, institutionally set up as this big compromise machine, as we know it, not sufficiently able to take this directional choice that Lucas describes? Will we be stuck in a limbo?
I would say that we do know what the direction is. Mm-hmm. We don't have a political consensus to take today the steps to adopt the measures, the decisions, and take the steps that will lead us in that direction. But we know the direction that the chartered course is there, and we have a set of not only independent reports, but political guidelines of the Commission, a strategic agenda of the European Council, telling us what is the direction. Of course, it's easier to say, let's go this way. It's more difficult to then, go that way and take and follow the path. So obviously there are many challenges ahead, even from an institutional and political perspective, to, adopt this decision. I mean, and it's nothing new. I mean, since the financial crisis, we created this idea of having a banking union. It's not done yet. There's this third pillar of deposit insurance scheme that it's still lacking. And the leaders are always saying we need to complete the banking union, but they don't have a majority to actually adopt the instruments for that. And like this, there's a few other examples. So I'm not saying it's just because we have these documents that it will be easy and we'll agree on that. And that's why I also say that it doesn't mean that the Trump administration is a good thing, a good news to Europe, but it will create pressure to take decisions that probably we wouldn't be able to take otherwise. And that's the history of Europe. We always only move when where we are on the brink of crisis or of meltdown or of bankruptcy or whatever. So we have to create this very dramatic atmosphere in order to take the bold moves. But throughout this history of European Union, we have been able to take those bold moves. And we did that when the pandemic came, to just give some recent examples. We did that when the pandemic came. And we did that to a large extent when Russia invaded Ukraine. So we now have the kind of atmosphere, and also we need leadership, but leadership is tested in times of need. And for sure, in the coming years, 5 years, we will have times of need. So what I'm saying is we have the environment that will possibly or desirably allow us to have the affirmation of leaderships taking bold moves. I'm not sure it will happen. I'm not saying, yeah, you can sleep tight and everything will be okay. But I think that, as I said, there's this very famous quote from Jean Monnet: Europe will be forged out of crisis and will be the sum of the solutions to each of those crises. So we're unfortunately, on the one hand, unfortunately, we're in crisis mode, in permanent crisis mode. But that is also what I'm trying to strike a positive note out of this. What I'm trying to say is that the fact that we're in crisis modes possibly gives us the kind of environment that we need to take the bold decisions that these reports are telling us that we need to take.
Joseph, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure that we are in crisis mode mentally. You're right, sort of always when Europe is at the cliff, then they act. But I think what is particular in the current situation is that the economic degradation is very gradual. For example, Germany has been in quasi-stagnation since 5-6 years, and it's only now slowly that there is sort of an awareness for that transcends sort of policy circles and that really, gets on front page news. Also, we are in a Europe where unemployment is at near record lows. So you can explain this for other reasons. There's demographic change and anything. But if we think the last time, for example, Germany did bold economic reforms was at the beginnings of the 2000s, and unemployment was at 10% or higher. So there was a real urgency there. Another fact is interesting. In France, for decades, polls have shown that the French are hyper pessimistic about their country, but actually quite content with their personal situation. And now we see sort of that the Germans are becoming more and more French in their mindset. We see that the Germans now also think,
but we're not happy.
We're not happy, yeah. Well, the French are not happy, pas content either, as a state of mind. But you see that the Germans also are unhappy about the direction of their country and think are negative, but their personal situation is actually quite good. And then you have all these geopolitical challenges that we have talked about. But a lot of them are kind of still theoretical. Are we really going to have this trade war that Trump launches? Or is this just a threat to get into a negotiating mode? The jury is still out. What is really going to happen on Ukraine? We don't know what he's going to do. So there's a lot of theoretical thing, which brings us to the point, if Europe is truly in crisis in everyone's senses and we're at the cliff of the average, you don't necessarily need leaders because everyone just does the thing to keep the ship together, because you have to, otherwise it blows apart. It's hard to say, for example, in the Eurozone crisis that we had true European leaders who were saving Europe maybe one. But there weren't that many of that, right? And the moment where you need leaders is where you're trying to prevent a situation that is likely to happen or could happen, and you're preventing it. So you actually have to go out on a pier and take a risk and say, we need to do this now in order to prevent the situation there. That is when you need leadership, right? And that is the question of now. Well, now we don't need people who fix the thing right now. Now we need people who are able to take risks and think a bit long term. And for a long time, this leadership was obviously coming from France, from Emmanuel Macron, who was always like in a sort of dystopian worldview where he thinks the world is becoming worse and worse, so we have to act now. The question is if a person like Friedrich Merz, who also kind of thinks in historical dimensions often, thinks in historical discontinuities, is able to be sort of a leadership person that is also thinking of vision and thinking of proactive reaction. That is perhaps the most important question for Europe in the next year is who's going to win this election in Germany and who is Merz really once he is in power.
Nadia, is there a sense of urgency among the general population?
I think I don't feel I don't feel placed to. I think everyone can answer that for themselves because we are all part of the general population. So you will come to an individual answer to that. But I think we see that, well, of course, there's good reason to be afraid of certain things. But maybe the question is, okay, so we agree there's a certain sense of urgency, but where does that push people, right? And do we think it mainly pushes them into a populist direction of saying, whoa, I'm panicked, where's the easy solution? And I don't think this is what seems to be happening for a majority of people, because what we also see is when we look at the European Union and the European institutions, that there is more trust in this, and people, there's this sort of silent agreement, yes, we are part of the European Union. And it doesn't mean that people agree on the liberal left-leaning European Union. That's what we see. So we have a European Union that is moving to the right, but people, but Marine Le Pen, who was promising in 2017 to exit both the European Union and the Euro, is far from promising that now because nobody wants it. So we are not looking at hardcore ideologists, we're looking at opportunistic populists who will offer whatever sort of seems to be working at that point in time. And what they are offering right now is to stay within the European Union. Then they will say, well, we are changing it from within, and they are. But it is still the European Union with functioning institutions, right? And from what I see, people do want these institutions, and in that way, people are not voting in panic mode, but they are seeing the offer that is formulated that we need a protection space, which is the European Union. And I don't think it is a super attractive offer to voters to say, well, at least you're not going to die by a Russian missile when you live in the European Union. That is not the it's not a great vision to live with. And maybe we should aim a little bit higher on what different offers to give to voters in order to convince them that solutions can come from a European level. But I mean, this has been said before, the last crisis, COVID, has proven that there was a European answer. And I think many people were happy with the fact that there was one.
There was like a Eurobarometer poll that just got out yesterday or the day before, showing that trust in the EU was sort of at record high levels. We shouldn't forget that. There is some political capital there.
And can I also push back a bit against this idea that Europe is only fought in crisis? I just don't think that's true, actually. I mean, Monet also has been dead for quite a while and hasn't seen a lot of the development we had. For example, the introduction of the euro was not done in a crisis mode. The single market was a bit like European sclerosis type, but we were far from like crisis mode. Like the big achievements of European integration did not happen in a crisis. And I think the danger of this crisis, like we rely on crises to do the things we need to do anyway, or we want to do anyway, is it has a huge cost in terms of erosion of legitimacy. Because you don't have the time to explain things to people, you don't have the time to forge like a big consensus. You just say, like in the Euro crisis, we have to do this now because we don't have an alternative. And that in a democracy is always a very bad like way of ramming the thing through. And I would also say the last 5 years, for example, I mean, the Union has moved to the right now, but what happened in the Green Deal area is actually pretty remarkable. Like the whole agenda that has been agreed and pretty consensually agreed, in terms of really putting instruments behind the ambition to get to climate neutrality is actually like a huge step that did not come from an immediate crisis mode, but came from the idea that we really have an objective, we agree on the objective, and then we even agree on the roadmap. But that's a rare exception, and now there's a big rollback against that. And maybe it was overdone in some areas, I don't know, but like I think that is the kind of policy-making mode that should be the normal way of doing things. And still there we have legitimacy problems. But I think that is what we should look at, and not at the idea that with high pressure, we get another moment where we can do like a big leap forward that then 5 years from now, people are pissed at the union because we didn't ask them.
Can I just say one thing, just because it's funny, but when you're talking about the Green Deal, right? And I think it's the big European moment of citizens standing up against a reform that was in theory supposed to be a climate-friendly reform. Those were the yellow vests, the gilets jaunes, right, in France. And I remember standing at one of their ronds-points, right? And they had this big Frexit sign. And I said, oh, do you really want to exit the European Union? And then one guy says, no, but this is how you get the attention. And I think there's some truth in that, of saying, well, we know that this is going to work. People up there are going to get really nervous if we say Frexit. And it doesn't necessarily say that they want it. It was basically one way of formulating an anti-elitist position of saying, we feel like you don't listen to us. And whoever you is interchangeable. You can be Paris, you can be Brussels. And there's always a truth in this, you don't listen. Like,
I actually want to get back to a bit, I want to get back to the discussion of the next 5 years. So you mentioned the last 5 years, the previous mandate of the Commission, the European Green Deal, and we've talked a lot about how to make change. Do we actually know what we want to do? Who can can it exchange? What do citizens think? But let's take a look at this plan that we have. And Lucas, in the beginning, you mentioned it almost nonchalantly, saying 3.5 challenges, the half challenge being the money. I wonder, is it really the half challenge, or is it the underlying challenge of all of the challenges that we have? Because in the past 2 days, what we also talked about a lot is this question of how do we fund the things we want to do for competitiveness? How do we fund defense? How do we fund climate action? And how do we do all of this without pitting it against the welfare state, against social spending, against everything else that we want to invest in. We've talked about the negotiations for the next multi-annual financial framework, so the long-term EU budget that will come up. Where or how do you see this financial question being solved or not solved in this Commission mandate, also against the background of the tight fiscal spaces in the member states? And of course, we are sitting in Berlin at the moment, where the debt brake has become quite the big problem for the last government.
I mean, I would say we have to differentiate between two things. One is like the amount of public money we want to have in certain policy areas or for certain policy goals, and the other one is the EU, the EU financial architecture. Because of course, it will stay true for a long time that most of public funding will come from government, like from national governments and national budgets. If we move from 1 to 1.5% of GDP for the EU budget, would be huge, but of course that doesn't match at all the money like member states put on the table. So I think the first question is, have we shifted in terms of political priorities, and does that get reflected in national budget choices? For example, defense, I find it very dangerous what like the chancellor does at the moment here in Germany, to suggest that we can massively increase our defense spending, and that has no effect on the other policy areas. And it's not only a question of spending, it's also a question of like resources, like administrative resources. It's a question of resources of like production. Like the economy has like has also its limits. So like the question is really, do we see a shift in policy priorities? And then the second question is, can we incorporate these shifted priorities in the EU budget? And I think the task for the next years is really to make good cases why we need new instruments at the European level. And then I'm fairly optimistic, if we have a good case for something, that we will find the money in the end. But my problem at the moment is, for example, on defense, as I already said, like I don't understand the case really yet. Like the theoretical case is clear, but how do we spend the money, who decides on it, and so on? Is, I think, the discussion we need to have first. The same on industrial policy, for example, and then the question on, if we want to do that, do we want to continue the other policies as is? Do we want to have the same level of structural policy? Do we want to have the same level of common agricultural policy? And then we have a picture. But I think the first question is, do we have a shift in policy priorities or in political priorities? And do we want to reflect them in the budgets or not?
Yeah, well, I actually think this half challenge, it's indeed the big challenge, because it's in a way instrumental to all the other challenges for defense. I mean, if we want to be serious on defense, we'll have to spend more and find ways to finance that spending. To enhance our competitiveness, we'll have to invest a lot. That's what the Draghi report is telling us. To be real and consequential and effective on the Green Deal, we will also need to keep on investing massively. And even for enlargement, part of the impact of enlargement will be financial. And even for rule of law, if we want to enlarge conditionality, that's also linked to the discussions on the budget. So the discussions on the budget, it's not everything. There's a lot more beyond the budget, but it is a key challenge and that we need to agree on, where there is obviously no consensus at the moment. It will be very difficult to forge a consensus. I mean, since at least 2020, the leaders are saying, and this is not an independent report, the leaders are saying themselves, we need new own resources. and not even talking about new, to pay for new challenges, just to repay, for instance, the loans of Next Generation EU. But they haven't been able to agree on any single new own resource. And we will need, we will need new own resource of the Union to be able to repay Next Generation EU. We will probably need new common borrowing for defense. This is something that is now being discussed. But again, these are very difficult decisions for several member states. For some of them traditionally because they're frugal, and in particularly now because in many member states the public finance situation is very strained. So obviously it's more difficult to consider more EU spending or more spending at the EU level. But I mean, we can't not have an omelet, we need the eggs, and we can't just keep on pushing more and more responsibilities to the European Union and demanding responses from the European Union in defense, in competitiveness, in green, in etc., and not handing it the resources that it needs to respond to the needs of the Europeans. So it's good that for every challenge or every crisis that we feel, we turn to the European Union for answers. But for the European Union to be able to respond, it needs the resources. So we will need to increase spending. We will need to find ways to do that. It will be very difficult. The political consensus is not there. Probably it will take several summits, several nights and in a row. And again, a very dramatic environment and for a decision to be taken. In the end, we'll have a decision. We will have to have a budget. Budget decisions are always MFF decisions are always very difficult. But in the end, we obviously we can have better decisions or not so good decisions. But this will be a key thing to watch and to follow, because on this depends a lot of what needs to be done in the several challenges that we've been discussing.
Yeah, I mean, in German, there's this saying, was nichts kostet, ist nichts wert. So what doesn't cost anything isn't worth anything. So obviously, the money is important, and it will come down to it. I also agree with Lucas. It's not only about the money. The questions that are attached to it are much larger. They're about sovereignty, about who gets to spend money, how it gets decided, how do you deal with industrial policy, competition policy. It's much larger than that. But it is through the money that you solve these questions. In a sense, Next Generation EU was this kind of moment where suddenly you had a lot of money that didn't exist and suddenly came off. And Next Generation EU also came with some kind of reform of how the EU is organized and how it is being spent. But you could have done this, you could have bring this forward much further, right? You could have done much more of it. And perhaps the challenge in the next sort of iteration is, yes, we probably need more money. But we need to begin this work that was done with Next Generation EU of how you spend money and how you delineate new competences much more, because you don't have to come up with it within a couple of weeks.
Before we move to the Q&A question, and this is just a reminder for our audience that if you do have questions to our fantastic panel, please put them in the Q&A box. Before we move to the Q&A though, I want to get away a bit from the funding and the money side, and maybe let's talk very briefly about this question of vision, because Lucas, you said there are very competing visions for the EU at the moment. Nadia, we're seeing actually the far right forces gaining traction in many member states, now also in the European Parliament elections. How do you think will this change the vision or the traction of the EU for the next 5 years? Can we already foresee some sort of directional change because of the forces that we're seeing throughout the continent?
I mean, what the far right parties and part also of the conservative parties, because the line separating these two isn't really that clear anymore in many countries. The direction they are going is obviously to take away power from the European Union and give priority to the nation state. And so when you talk about vision, the question is, what vision do they offer to us? And I've been looking at this before the European elections, at the different campaigns of far-right parties in Europe, and the vision they offer is a backward vision. It's like a European version of Trumpism, make X, Y country great again, right? And then it will depend where you live, what period you're looking at that was supposedly great. Usually it's an imaginary period. And then you work with images of fluffy nostalgia that give you this feeling that once upon a time there were no problems, and we can go back to this because you all know this nation that we're all living in. And then it is a very simple story because it works with folkloric images that everyone can relate to, right? So it's like a cartoon of your own country, and you can sort of vote for your own cartoon and say, yeah, I want my country to look like this. And in this cartoon, there are no problems and no issues that would be part of the native cartoon. They all move in. So that's the vision, and it's not a super elaborate vision. And I would say in a way it shouldn't be super hard to develop other visions, but maybe it is. Did that answer your question? I don't know.
Yes.
Okay.
Would you like to add on that, or otherwise I think I will start moving to the Q&A.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah. I have to say, my eyes are not very good with the lights, but we have one question. Do you think the so often claimed French-German EU tandem is permanently shifting to a quadruplet, including Italy and Poland, until 2029? Joseph.
Yes, possibly. I mean, someone at our conference was saying perhaps we're moving into sort of Germany's age, with a German as commission president, a German as the head of the EPP, the most important faction in the European Parliament, and possibly Merz as the new leader in Germany. So there are three very powerful German CDU people who will probably be quite important in determining the fate of the European Union for the next years. But yeah, I mean, France obviously can't do it alone anymore. Macron is weakened. It's important that you've mentioned, Lucas, that it's not always crisis that where you have advantages. By the way, it's also not always you have big EU advantages when France is strong. For example, if you think about the Euro and the Maastricht Treaty and everything there, Mitterrand, the French president at the time, was very much at the end of his period as well, and living actually weakened in Paris. So it's not a precondition, historic precondition, to have a strong French president. And then obviously, just because of the geopolitical situation, Poland is so important, and because Europe has become more eastwards, and then Giorgia Meloni as part of this new far right, which is now somehow part of this European grand coalition politics, as we see it in the European Parliament. So I think, yeah, we're definitely moving away from this from this exclusivity of the Franco-German couple, but it's a development that we've seen for a long time already.
And I think there was always a misunderstanding that the Franco-German couple is a nucleus thing, like that this is like the smallest unit at the European level because they have so much in common. I think, like, if you look at the usual allies, for example, of the Germans in EU context, it's not the French, right? Like that's like the Dutch. That depends a bit on the coalition on the subject, but of course, the appeal of the Franco-German engine is that if you agree something, then it has pretty broad appeal in the Union. And I think that's still true to a large extent, that if those two agree, it's very hard to make policy against them. That, of course, like if you enlarge that to the Poles and the Italians, that makes it even less easy to work against a compromise between these four. But I think that the main question, or the orientation of the whole system towards a Franco-German working relationship, I think, would still be there. The problem is that it's just not working at the moment, and then it loses all its appeal because then it has no integrative power.
But maybe one thing. So when we talk about the famous French-German motor, if we are German, or couple if we are French, then what does this mean? It's also that it's something that is politically wanted and financed, and where a lot of will and money has been going into over decades. And this is why we have a lot of personal interconnections between France and Germany. And yes, I do think we definitely need to enlarge this motor to a quadruple motor, right? But then we also need more knowledge, especially about Poland, and more personal interactions. And I did an Erasmus year in Poland 20 years ago, and we were 100 Erasmus students in the city of Krakow. And I think that is basically one street of German au pairs in the 10e arrondissement of Paris, right? So we just need a lot more personal ties that bring us together.
I think this is actually
I think it's actually a good thing that this nucleus, or not nucleus, but this arrangement, or whatever you want to call it, is enlarged to other partners. I would also include Spain as also a big member state. Of course, we all know that the Franco-German engine has been a structural feature of the European Union, and it has obviously its major importance. It will still be like that in the future, but it's actually a good thing if we're not just dependent on these two countries, and if we're able to enlarge this initiative, this pushing forward to other, particularly to other big member states.
Yeah, I think very important points, and especially also I think not just to recall that the Franco-German engine is not just the leaders, but it is ingrained very much in the country's societal, political, administrative spheres. So it goes much deeper than just the relationship between Scholz and Macron. The second question is a bit long. I will read it out. I agree that EU integration and deeper cooperation within the EU takes place both through crisis as well as through more regulated normal channels via Commission proposals in circumstances of less directly immediate urgency. Single market, EU, US, China, Green Deal, linked to next generation EU. In that sense, there is, however, nothing new. I cannot actually recall a time when the EU was not facing crisis. So do you think the several current crises the EU is currently facing are on a different level than the many previous crises?
Well, I would just say that each crisis is different from the previous one. And indeed, what is new now, or kind of probably a bit different, is that we have overlapping crises, or we have more recurrent crises and overlapping crises that obviously the challenge is bigger to face multiple crises at the same time. But then the big question is not so much if we're having crisis, because more or less we'll always have one or another, is how we respond to crisis. And we have not always responded satisfactorily to crisis. And I would argue, for instance, that the European response to the financial crisis was in many ways flawed. And coming from Portugal, I can give you many examples of how flawed it was. Whereas, for instance, when COVID came, the response to create next generation EU was totally different. So the way you respond to crisis, that is the big thing, to strive for a good European response in solidarity and creating European instruments that do respond to the needs of the people. And the challenge here is to be able to agree on those responses that are the good solutions to the crisis.
I think this is a very interesting question, because we do, as you say, have very overlapping crises right now that also risk taking attention and resources from each other, right? So if we get in a situation where competitiveness is pitted against security, which is pitted against climate, how do we get to a solution? So is this a different situation than other crises, Lucas?
I mean, yes, we have a war in Europe, like a land war, which we haven't had at that scale pretty much since the Second World War, except for the Western Balkans, but that was more regional, with not one big actor that could be dangerous for the rest of the continent. So yes, it's different because that has a different quality, and it brings also an area where we don't have a lot of European integration to the forefront, which is also different from the Euro crisis, where I completely agree with you. It was not well handled, but we had the tools, we just didn't use them at the time. Whereas for security, I think we are far away from having these common tools. I'm not sure about the overlapping thing, because, for example, like migration and the Euro crisis overlapped, but I think, yeah, the qualitatively different situation now. I don't know what that means in terms of like the solution. I think also, I keep coming back to that, but the whole climate question has also become a lot more acute, and is one of these crises that are looming in the background. And maybe last point, I'm not sure on the economy, we are in a crisis. As Joseph said, it's like or Draghi called it slow agony. I think that's different from like this acuteness of like we have to do something now, which has its danger in its own right, but I don't think it's a crisis.
Actually, like as a historian, one is always a bit skeptical when one hears in politician speeches or journalist articles this word unprecedented. We're sort of in this unprecedented thing, and as a historian, you just think like usually 99% of the cases the word unprecedented is really terrible and usually wrong. But yeah, I mean, I think sort of the geopolitical crisis, Ukraine, that is something very new. And maybe to finish a bit on a positive thing as well, we can also think of the crisis we're not having. And Lucas, in a sense, sort of the economic financial crisis that we had, with the Eurozone crisis. The question, is the Euro area going to blow up? We're not having this crisis right now, even though we have a difficult fiscal situation in France. We're not close really to having that full-blown crisis. And that is also because we have learned our lessons from the past. And so this can give us hope to some extent. There are crises that could happen, but we're not having. And that's also because policy changes have been done.
Very good. I would take two questions now at once for you, Nadia. I think they partially relate, or maybe not. You will have to tell us. One is why is oh my God, I cannot read. Why is far right-wing nationalism rising in EU countries? And the second one is, even if TikTok and online disinformation are not the only political drivers, online disinformation and the capacity to carry out effective online campaigning do play a role. And the more extreme parties are better at both at the moment. How far away are mainstream parties from catching up to the online game? And what about the EU institutions? How far away are they from taking effective policy action? So a lot of questions, you can pick and choose. But I think they go in a similar direction.
Yeah, I mean, one is more broad, one is more specific, right? And the question of why is far right-wing nationalism rising in the EU, or we could also say globally, right? Because we also see it in India, we see it with Trump in the United States. There are many books on that, and you can pick your theories. And one thing that I said before is I think there is a certain amount of control over how much room we want to give right-wing opinions in the discourse, but then I also think that they do not completely come out of nowhere. And I do think that the national frame maybe gives people more of a feel of security than a bigger frame. So maybe that's a logical response to crisis, also to retract into that. And when we look, for example, because that's the country I sort of know best, when we look at France, I also think that in the case of France, Islamist terror has played a role in destabilizing a feeling of security, because I think we just looked at the big attacks, but it never really stopped. It went into the countryside, it went into small places, and it did create a real sense of terror, which led to a certain, which made racism that was already there bigger and led to a certain form of xenophobia. And I also think that, so what is right-wing, when we sum it up, right, what is right-wing nationalism? A lot of it is built on racism, And I think when we look at the example of Germany, Germans seem to have felt that they can get people from Turkey or other countries, and they can call them Gastarbeiter, which means we're just having them for a short time to do the work and then leave again, which is not what happened. So on one hand, actively promoting a more diverse society, but never actually naming it, and then sort of expecting the country not to change, even though you do bring people inside. And then you now have, in fact, a more diverse society. And it's like people have to adapt to that fact, and they adapt in different ways, and some adapt with a backlash, with a racist backlash, I would say. But there are also many other answers to this question.
Well, I would just say, and actually linking this to the different visions that you were talking about earlier, yeah, we do have, in many EU countries, far-right populist parties on the rise and coming into power. And that leads to the fact that, yeah, we do have different visions of Europe. Yeah. We have even countries that are not wanting to leave Europe, but they want a different Europe. They want a more intergovernmental Europe where the nation state is more relevant. They want to scale back some of the powers that have been given to Brussels back to the national governments. And this obviously creates a difficulty for all of these challenges that we were discussing before, because it's more difficult to find common solutions to these challenges when we have a more diverse set of member states wanting different things, some actually wanting to integrate further, but some wanting to disintegrate at least partly. And so this is part of the big challenge politically and institutionally that we have, is how to reach an agreement, particularly on matters on which we all have to agree that require unanimity or consensus, when there are such different views, and these different views are very much linked to this rise in far-right populism and Eurosceptic views. So this is, one of the biggest challenges of finding ways to overcome this. And I trust that the new president of the European Council, who has taken office just today, who I know very well, I've worked with him for many years, he will not have an easy task finding a middle ground and a solution on which all are able to agree on. But that's his task now, and I think that is probably the best suited person to forge compromises and build bridges and find a way out of deadlocks in which we will find ourselves in.
Which is actually a question that we didn't have time to cover so much, the new institutional setup and the persons that now actually occupy the offices that will lead us to the next 5 years, perhaps in the end, but there are still a few more questions. And I think one connects quite well with what you just said. If France and Germany are currently quite weak politically, does that not provide space for other member states to step in particular, perhaps Poland? Joseph?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think, the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of, other countries stepping in. There was someone at the conference who was mentioning, for example, that Next Generation EU was initially a Spanish concept that was put forward. Some people see that skeptically. I can also remember that
many fathers and mothers.
Many fathers and mothers. Yeah, no, I remember at the time when Macron was giving his first COVID speech, that was like, in end of February, he already said, there has to be a common European answer. So yeah, success, many mothers and fathers. But you have Spain, you have, the Netherlands, who has played a much more active role, Italy to some extent, Poland, Estonia, Callas. The more the better, the more leaders, the more people who come forward with ideas and push something and build coalitions, the better that is. And I think, in a sense, what you maybe also see in the past years with the European elections and the rise also in voter turnout at European elections is a sort of realization amongst voters and in capitals that the European game is really important and that you have to be there and that you have to propose something and that it's not only European policy, but it's economic policy, it's green policy, it's all kinds of stuff. So in a sense, I see compared sort of to the agony of the 2000s, which often seemed sort of very slow moments for Europe, apart from the enlargement agenda, of course, you see many more countries getting involved and proactively pitching something because everyone has understood, hey, you know, Brussels really matters, Europe really matters. It's not only the Financial Times who's understood it, and they have tons of correspondents in there. If they're there, it's probably because it matters as well.
And maybe, I mean, countries like Poland, or you mentioned Kaja Kallas, Baltics, they're not just gaining importance because France and Germany are weak, but also because they were right. Yeah. they have been saying for years that they do not feel secure because they are afraid of Russian expansionism and aggression. And unfortunately, they were right. So, of course, that gives them a strong position.
And maybe it's also not such a bad thing that we don't have like one country or two countries having the overall lead in a way, but to have, as Josefka just said, or I mean, I think Nadia, you went also in this direction, to have in certain areas, certain countries that have a special interest, special knowledge, and also a certain drive. Like I'm sure with the Polish presidency, but even independent of that, we will have Poland and the Baltics as champions of more common security policy. And we have, I always had, for example, the Spanish and the Germans on renewables, or like, and I think we can have tons of these, and the Italians on migration, which however we judge that, but I think this thing that countries take an interest in European policy in an area where they care a lot about, I think is actually a good thing, because that then makes it a bit more decentralized in terms of where the drive comes from.
Mm-hmm. Which I think connects, well, at least partially, to the next question. Many of the policy areas discussed here have a strong external dimension. And how far do you see a strengthening of common European foreign policy a necessity and a probable development over the coming years? Anyone?
I mean, I would...
It is a necessity. Whether we'll be able to achieve it is a totally different question. Usually, it's not mentioned in the question. Usually, this is linked to the issue of voting rules, whether we'll be able to move from unanimity to qualified majority voting on foreign policy, which is a very bold move that I don't know whether we'll be able to take that step, to be honest, because there are, when it comes to foreign policy, many vital national interests at stake that make it difficult for member states to withdraw their veto power. But I mean, on the just foreign and security policy, on the security front, clearly we need to do a lot, and I don't know if we'll do everything that needs to be done, but for sure this will be a mandate in which we'll take steps forward in terms of strengthening our security policy. But it will remain an area where, if you take the conflict in the Middle East or several other issues in which it is always very difficult to find a common position within the European Union, because there are strong and very different and diverging views within Europe regarding many foreign policy issues, and I don't think that will change dramatically.
But maybe there's also a difference between like the classic CFSP, like do we agree that we are strongly concerned or very concerned or only a bit concerned on a coup in a country somewhere, or so like the real action of like common security, foreign security policy, and like the more like the bigger picture questions where we need a common answer, like how do we work with China, how do we work with the US now? And I think that's not even in the areas that are covered like by foreign policy, but that like means, for example, do we have a common trade approach to China and the US in the next 4 years? And maybe then also we can focus on that and less on like the procedural aspects of CFSP.
All right.
Should I quickly comment on the TikTok question?
Yes.
Yes. I'm not sure how central that is, because we don't have to tell ourselves that the far right is only winning on TikTok. It's not. When we look at the French media, you cannot have a TV panel on whatever channel without giving a prominent role to far right thinkers, leaders, whatever. We have CNews, which is basically Fox News in French. We have, for example, in the Netherlands, in the campaign of Geert Wilders, a public broadcaster did a television show for children, informing them about whom to vote for, and every politician got to do something fun, and some were playing sports. And Wilders went to how do you call that in English? Like an asylum for pets, like where you bring your pets if they don't have an owner. And he was basically literally petting kittens during the whole interview and putting them to his face, and they were very cute kittens. So we don't need TikTok to do that because public broadcasters are doing that. And I also think that if anybody wants to work on why it's the far right that is so connected to cats, and why also Islamistic terrorists also like cats, there's something going on, but no. So yes, it's not that much only a TikTok problem. Yes, it is a problem, but it's completely mainstreamed now. So.
Right, thank you. Before we come to an end, let me ask you one final question, a final remark round. So to say, the title of our panel is "Where do we want to stand in 2029?" So at the end of this Commission mandate, if you were to choose one initiative that could be implemented by the end of this mandate, which one would it be? What is for you the most necessary action to take for the EU in its next legislative term? Whoever wants to go first.
Well, beyond obviously the Russian threat and the issue of Ukraine and dealing with that, which would be the obvious answer, to have a good solution to this conflict. But just beyond that, what I would think that I would choose and would like to mention is, again, going back to the financial issue and to reinforcing the own resources of the EU, because we always have this infighting in which we need more money to do more things, but member states don't want to increase their national contribution. So the only way out of this deadlock is to have direct own resources of the EU, that it will be absolutely, it's not a sexy topic, but it will be absolutely key for the Union to be prepared to tackle then all the other challenges, the ones that we have now and the ones that we will have in the future. So this is the thing that I would like to see happen.
On resources, Thiago. Other wishes for the end of 2029?
I think just the most realistic big jump in sort of European integration over the next couple of years is in defense. I think because there's this urgency with Ukraine, and I see sort of with a CDU government in Germany a pathway to them being able to, I don't know, jump over their shadow and perhaps do something in terms of new financial resources for the EU if it's in a defense context. And I think it wouldn't only have a sort of defense and Ukraine dimension, it will also have sort of an economic integration dimension and an industrial policy dimension as well. We sometimes tend to forget that sort of defense and industrial policy has also spillovers into the rest of the economy in terms of research and development. So I think that is perhaps the train on which you can hop on most, that has most speed, that can bring you somewhere where you solve other problems Europe has at the same time.
So more common spending on defense.
Yeah, and then
defense
reorganizing, like defense spending along that in terms of public procurement, etc., and thus integrating in a sort of classical European sense industries and thus political competences and sovereignties.
So defense spending for Joseph. Lucas or Nadja?
I'm really not a strategic thinker, I think. I'm sorry.
And Lucas goes first, and you can have a second.
I want Europe to be safe from a Russian aggression in 29. I'm not an expert, so I don't know how to do that. Other people know how to do that, but that's something we should make sure by then.
I would like to extend that to seeing more concrete offers, plans put into action of how we're going to protect our citizens in times of a changing climate. How do we, like, when we look at all the floods that happened during this summer, and then every time again, we see the pictures of the people standing on their houses, we see the cars in the streets, and that's also the media to blame, and it's covered like a catastrophe, and then in the bottom of the article you read, this is part of the climate change. And then 2 weeks later, there's an article that nobody reads that is about how the rivers were actually, there are dams around, along the rivers, but they were in such a poor shape that they were actually collapsing because they were full of holes and nobody ever even bothered to mow the lawn on the thing. And just to have a bit more of a concrete preparation that we can also feel that this threat is taken seriously.
Yeah. So at the end, it all boils down to security, both geopolitically and on the ground, and money.
Oh, and solidarity. We also like solidarity. We would like less racism. That would be nice.
All right, thank you so much, Lucas.
The wish
Thiago.
list is long. I mean, we were picking just one.
It was just one.
Exactly.
So this is just the first.
one.
This was just on the very top of the very long list of wishes we have for the next 5 years in the EU, and also on the top of the list of a lot of challenges that we have. Thank you very much, Lucas, Thiago, Joseph, and Nadja, for being here with us and for discussing the very big question of where do we want to be in 2029 here today at the end of the Pariser Platz Dialogue of the Jacques Delors Center. And thank you for being with us and for the very good questions.